So good afternoon, everybody. My name, as you heard, Jonathan Jacobs. I'm leading the neuroscience, also the data science initiatives for Simrise in the Scent and Care division. And that's a global initiative that's been rolled out of Singapore. My background is really very heavily into quantitative research. I'm a mathematician by trade originally, statistics my thing. And in the last decade or so, I've branched out into neuroscience, which is kind of psychology, and also some of the techniques really leverage a bit on my kind of mathematical expertise, in particular the EEG technique, which I will tell you a little bit more about later. Right, how do I move on to the next? Okay, that's a bit different from what I was expecting. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Simrise first. We have a lot of our competitors here, as has been previously mentioned. So they will definitely know a lot about Simrise. We're again a leading producer of fragrance, flavors, and cosmetic ingredients. So here's a video that will just give you a little bit more flavor of Simrise, the Scent and Care division.
We are eclectic and iconic entrepreneurs. For 200 years, the finest of fine fragrances have shaped our living history and point us to a better future. Symbiosis is in our DNA. We intersect nature, chemistry, and culture to create human alchemy and elevate fine fragrance into an avant-garde art form. Our perfumers intensify their creativity by collaborating with artists and experts in the sciences and the senses. We challenge the boundaries of scientific reality. Using thoughtful passion and creative intuition, we transform the ephemeral into the beneficial to captivate, create well-being, and positively affect humanity. By exploring ethically, we are shaping a new era in fragrance that is sensual, not superfluous. So every elegant drop has the power to touch the senses, the soul, and the world.
Okay, slide 3, please. So yeah, I'm from the Scent and Care division. So Scent and Care is mainly about fragrance, and we provide fragrance for household goods, hair care products, beauty care products, cosmetics, and also we focus on the fine fragrance as well, which is the sexiest part of the business, I guess, the most glamorous part. But we also look at cosmetic ingredients in our Beauty Plus program. We integrate both fragrance and cosmetic ingredients. And we also have the oral care division, which is looking at flavorings for toothpaste and mouthwash. And we've also recently integrated into Simrise Diana, which is looking at pet food. So I'm just waiting for the moment that someone has a brilliant idea about herding some cats into a focus group discussion room. So that's probably coming in the future. I've even been asked about, can we apply neuroscience to cats, for example? So that could be another something for the future, but maybe not just yet. So through all these different categories that we work in, we're trying to touch the consumer with our scent. Better living through scent is our motto. And you can see in this space, there's so many different raw ingredients, thousands and thousands of raw ingredients that can be used in all sorts of different combinations to create fragrance. And it creates a very large space in which to work, many, many possibilities. So there's a huge room for creativity in the space. And we really want to use that fragrance to help brands connect with their consumer. So we're a B2B company. We don't transact directly with the consumer. This means that we have to be very active in our consumer and marketing insights department, really have to reach out to the consumer to make sure that we have the insights necessary to provide our customers with the right kind of fragrance that's going to help enhance their brand. Now, understanding the consumer is not an easy business. A lot of pitfalls that are out there. An example I'll give you is from fine fragrance. Why do I talk about fine fragrance? Well, it's pretty sexy for our industry, fine fragrance. But also a lot of trends in the other categories are derived from fine fragrance. So if you can get the fine fragrance part right, you'll have a lot of spillover into your other categories later on. So I just ask the audience, maybe you can shout out a few numbers for me. Last year, how many fine fragrances were launched, do you think, globally? So shout out some numbers. 3,000. That's not too far away. 3,000 is pretty close. Actually, it could be 3,000. I have no idea what the number is for 2016. So apologies for that. I only have data up until 2015, and the number was 2,044. Now, a lot of these fragrances are a little bit niche, so that number may be a little bit inflated because of these very, very small fragrance launches. But I think when you go to peruse the fragrances at the duty-free in Changi Airport, nice airport, you really don't see 2,044 fragrances on the shelf. And what happened to all the fragrances launched in 2014, 2013? Hardly just a tiny proportion of them are left standing on the shelves. Now, all of these fragrances will have been carefully researched. Most of them will be carefully researched, consumer tested. Usually there'll be some element of validation with some quantitative research. In order to be launched, you would think that that they've done well in the consumer testing. So what went wrong when it came to the actual performance in the market? It didn't work. So that's something we are really trying to work on with our consumer marketing insight team in Symrise. So the strategy we are using in Symrise is really to integrate many different modes of research and many modes of data collection about the consumer. We have the neuroscience, which gives us a very accurate impression of what is happening with the consumer. It's very high resolution, very rich data about how the consumer feels, about particular fragrances, emotional connections, quite a good read on those with the neuroscience. We also have the sensory science, which bridges the gap between the consumer and our technical creative people, the perfumers, so that everything is translated for them as insights to be able to use in their product development. We also have our traditional research, things like qualitative research, can be pretty useful in understanding the why part, not so much the what part, but the why part, which neuroscience gives us very well, the what part. And also, I think qualitative research is pretty helpful in terms of looking at the emotional connection again. We also do other things like the social listening, which we talked a little bit about earlier today. But that's more of a background, more of a context for us to understand other brands and how they're working in the market. Okay. Don't know how many of you have heard of Daniel Kahneman's book. Maybe a quick show of hands. Who's heard of Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow? Okay, not bad. Maybe 20% of the audience. Well, when we do the traditional research, particularly the quantitative survey type research, it really is inevitable that we're tapping into the system 2 type thinking of the consumer, the rational, logical conclusions of the consumer. Unfortunately, even though the consumer probably, many consumers I think feel that they're really consciously making decisions. That is a strong feeling that we get, that we are really in charge, our conscious mind is in charge of our decisions. But studies have shown that subtle influences can really change the outcome of our decisions, and we are totally not aware of it when we're asked about it. So it's more the system 1 type thinking, the fast thinking, automatic, subconscious thinking that drives our behavior. One possible explanation for this, I don't want to get too technical on you, is that the part of the brain responsible for the system 1, the fast thinking, the raw emotional part, the amygdala, is more closely connected to the part of the brain that is responsible for action versus the rational part of the brain, the conscious prefrontal cortex, which is a bit less well connected to the action center. So in neuroscience, here are some of the modes of data collection. I think at Simrise we have a slightly broader definition compared with some of the other definitions I've seen at the conference so far. Some people just define neuroscience as only looking at direct measurement of the brain, which is the neurometrics side. We also like to include the biometrics and also the psychometrics inside our neuroscience program. All of these approaches, the fundamental thing uniting all these approaches is we want to understand the consumer response without the consumer actually having to say anything. So they just experience the fragrance or the ingredient, and we will measure them, and we'll get the response from that. They do not need to verbalize anything. I think Gemma yesterday afternoon mentioned a little bit about how they used the implicit response time testing in their study. So that comes under the psychometrics part. Okay, all the different tools in neuroscience, they have strengths and weaknesses. So at Simrise, in order to make sure that we have covered all the possible blind spots in this kind of research, we use a combination of different tools. My specialty is EEG, electroencephalogram, which is those funny headsets you sometimes see on people in some of the research. EEG is really fantastic for fragrance because, as you know, fragrance is something that evolves over time. You first spray the fragrance, say a perfume, you smell it 30 seconds later, it's changed already. So we want to capture that evolution with something that's time sensitive, and EEG is something that is very time sensitive. So that's why we really like EEG. We also have eye tracking. Eye tracking allows you to understand the interaction of the visual context with the consumer perception of fragrance. You can change things very subtly visually, and perception of fragrance will be quite different. So there's a lot of variables you can play with to enhance or possibly, if you get it wrong, diminish the enjoyment of a fragrance through the other senses that you stimulate. I won't go into too much detail on the others for now. You saw some implicit response time testing yesterday with Gemma. As I mentioned earlier, at the end of the roundtable, at the end of the panel, when Divya asked me a question, we do almost all of our analysis, well, all of our analysis in-house, and almost all of the data collection in-house as well. And we have developed specialized software, which we call Genesis, which integrates all the different tools together. All those tools I showed you on the previous slide, synchronizes the data streams, will perform some pre-processing of all those signals, and will actually produce something meaningful in a very quantitative manner. So you end up with what looks like a kind of questionnaire data at the end of it, but it's all been generated from neuroscience sources rather than traditional responses. So that's the software portion. This is really unreliable. It's like my remote control at home. So now the hardware part of things. We have a specialized station, which we call the Scorpion Chair, which integrates all the different hardware techniques together for data collection. So there's a specialized environment in which we can kind of stimulate the senses of the consumer, visually, tactile, as well as the fragrance, of course. And we have quite a few of these parked around the world, offices in Singapore, India, China, Germany, France, United States, Brazil. So this is a pretty big program for us. Just want to mention, now that I've got 10 minutes left, I just want to mention that this program was born in Singapore, and as such, it's largely focused on Asia-Pacific markets so far. So here are some of the countries that we've done testing in with neuroscience methods. Thailand was the very first one where we did a big proof of concept test. It was the first kind of fairly large-scale neuroscience testing I did, sample size 160, and it was really something that convinced me. I'm pretty skeptical as a mathematician, so it was something that really convinced me that this is a really valuable approach to understanding the consumer. We've since rolled out to other regions, educated the teams in the different regions, and we've done tests in Western Europe, Africa, North America, South America. We're currently in the middle of a huge test, massive test for neuroscience, anyway, with a sample size over 400 in the United States of America. And I feel really grateful because I can sit here in Singapore, someone is doing the work over in the US collecting all this data, and I'll have the pleasure of analyzing and learning from all this information about what's happening in the US, and it will really help me develop my research methods even more. As I mentioned earlier, every study I will use to do some research on research, learn about the actual methods, think about ways I can enhance, introduce a little bit of testing here and there, experimenting, as well as doing the normal scheme of things. Let me give you a concrete example with the implicit response time testing. This is an example in the shower gel category. 2 fragrances tested here, citrus and vanilla. I've cut out a lot of the attributes, just going to focus on 3 attributes that we asked the consumer about, starting off with just a traditional explicit survey. So the possible responses to this were yes, no, don't know. And you're going to see the percentage of yeses here. Oh, I shouldn't have put so many transitions in here. It's going to take a while to get through. And I've skipped too far now. Okay, so those are the explicit results. Wow, this is really small. Sorry about that. Let's focus on fresh. Citrus and vanilla. 83% of respondents said citrus was fresh, while 86% said vanilla is fresh. So it seems like if you're looking for freshness as an attribute, vanilla is doing slightly better here. However, when we take into account response time being indicative of how certain the respondent was about these responses, you get quite a different picture emerging. I think I've skipped one too many. There we go. So now I've color coded to indicate certainty. The light blue, high certainty. The darker colors, low certainty. So people were very fast to say citrus is fresh. They were pretty confident about this. It was a very natural association for them to make. However, for vanilla, although they ended up saying it was fresh, they had to and think, is it fresh? And eventually they decided, yes, it was fresh. But it wasn't a natural association for them. So for me, the moral of the story here is if I want freshness as an attribute that people automatically associate with my shampoo, I want to go for the citrus, even though when I just look at the pure explicit data, it was a slightly lower score. So this neuroscience portion of incorporating response time really enhances your data, gives you more insight. So it's very sad for me as a person who's really into quantitative research. But what I see is the traditional methods of survey that we use, that some of these surveys go over 30 minutes. I really worry about the quality of the data you get from these kind of surveys. It's tapping into the system 2 type thinking. That generally is not a good predictor of actual behavior. So I worry a little bit about validity. I also worry a little bit about being a maths person. I'm very anal about statistics. I worry about some of the statistical testing methods that are used in the industry. And I see there's a tendency for the kind of testing we do to generate false positives. So you think you have a winner when you don't. That's due to the testing method basically being a little bit too aggressive. However, if you were conservative with your testing, using the traditional research, because it's so insensitive to the consumer for all the reasons I just described, that you end up with nothing. Everything is parity. You'll get no interesting conclusion. So you're either conservative, end up with lots of parities, or you're a little bit aggressive, which seems to be the norm, and you end up with quite a high likelihood of false positives. Unfortunately, people put a lot of stock still in this traditional quantitative research. And when they see, oh, it's statistically significant, they immediately think, okay, that's confirm plus chop, as we would say in Singapore. Unfortunately, as Mark Twain says here, it's not what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's the things you know for sure that just aren't true. So I'll just finish off with one little project that we completed in Taiwan. This was for a shampoo. And we wanted to have the association of the fragrance being the similar feeling to that of being in love. So this is something we validated with the neuroscience approach. And I want to show you this video, which is the commercial that came with it. So it's all in Mandarin, but I think you'll get the feeling even if you don't speak Mandarin.
没想到新大厂也这么科技耶！
So before I finish, I'd just like to weigh in on the debate that we had, the last couple of days about whether, neuro can replace qual. My stand is quant is in much more danger. The traditional quant is in much more danger. Those survey questionnaire type approaches, I think they really can be phased out over time and replaced with the neuroscience, especially if you use neuroscience with some explicit component inside. I don't really feel like some of the benefits of qual that you get that we've seen presented earlier today, I don't think they can be replaced with neuroscience. Right, thank you very much.